So what did you and Granddad do when the kids were young? You were 20 years old when you started having kids, and you worked during that time. Where did you work at?
Well, when I first started working, I worked at a cotton mill there in McKinney and had an apartment. That's before I married. I worked at the cotton mill. And when we went over there, my girlfriend that I graduated from high school with was a year or two older than me. I was one of the youngest in my graduating class. I just turned 17 before school was out when I graduated. I had just turned 17 when I graduated, so I was one of the youngest in the class. And but I was 18 when I went to apply for this job, and the boss didn't give my friend any trouble. He just took her application, and when I put my application in, he said, "Now how old are you?" I said, "I'm 18. He said, "Now don't lie to me, because I can find out. I have ways to find out. Now don't lie to me." And I said, "I'm not lying to you, I'm 18. But he had me to, I couldn't go right to work because I had to get me a birth certificate and bring back to him before he'd hire me. And after he had hired me, we worked in the evening, and we was walking down the street home that night. I guess we got off about 12. And we was walking down the street home. We lived straight down the street from where we worked. And we met some girls meeting us, going to, I guess, home to their place. And they stopped me, and one of them confronted me. Says, "I want to know how you can work up there," and they wouldn't hire me. They wouldn't hire me because I wasn't 18. And they saw me coming out, and they had hired me. And I said, "Well, I'm 18. I think she was either 14 or 16, but she confronted me out there on the street why they wouldn't hire her, but they hired me. So that was my first job. And then after that, Granddaddy, after we married, Granddaddy worked all that time at the VA hospital because he was in the medics in the service, and and that's what he was doing in the service. And so he's always worked at the VA hospital from that time on, doing the same thing, working in hospitals.
Kind of as an orderly, or what?
Huh?
As an orderly, or what did he do?
As a nurse's aide.
Nurse's aide.
He was working right along with the nurses all the time at the hospitals, and worked at night a lot. And I did various things. I worked mostly office work from the time we married. Most of the time it was office work, some type of office work. We moved to Marlin, and I worked at a courthouse in Marlin with the agriculture department in some of their programs, agricultural programs. And I went to work first for a clothing place when we first moved to Marlin. I worked at a clothing place, and it was run by the manager and his wife. He was a manager, he had an office, and his wife worked as a floor lady, and his daughter worked at a machine, and his son worked in the back, and examining the clothing after they was made. So the family all was employed there, and he was a manager that would just have, I think his disposition at work depended on how he and his wife got along at home before they came to work, because he would yell. I was working in the office and sharing it with him, and it was a glassed-in office, and he would yell and talk so that people would look up from their machines to see what was going on in there. And that's what I put up with for a long time, is his yelling and cussing and all of that. And I know I went home one day, I kept thinking, I can't stand this anymore, the way he carries on. And I went home one day, and Granddaddy had bought a new television set, and I said, "Oh, you bought something else new, and I can't stand that job." But he was so overbearing, and he and his wife would have their lunch at this big table where I worked at lunchtime while I was out, and they'd go in there and have lunch together. And one day he sat down at the table after they'd had lunch, and his wife's purse was on the table, and a heavy cup. There's a cafe next door, and there was a heavy cup sitting there with just a little coffee in it. And he wanted the space, and he just took his arm like that and cleared the table. Coffee cup and her purse and everything was over in the floor. So even though she was a floor lady, she went over and picked up her purse and went out the door and went down the sidewalk, and she was gone for the day. So that's a thing I was putting up with, and I fixed out the payroll one day after everybody had signed their card. I mean, had signed out at the clock. And I picked up the time cards, and I figured and did the payroll and put it in an envelope to send it to Dallas. And he let me finish all of that. And then he said, "Well, I have some bad news for you. I'm going to have to let you go." But he didn't do this until I finished his payroll and put it in the bag for him. And he told me he'd have to let me go. And I wrote this letter, a long letter. I was so aggravated at the guy that I wrote this long letter and told him that I was raised with a big family, and I had a bunch of brothers. And I had never been treated by any of my brothers. I had never been treated like he had talked to me and treated me while I was working there. And I unloaded everything in that letter. So I felt better after I wrote it. And then I was scared to mail it, so I didn't want to get sued. So I didn't mail the letter, but I was okay after that anyway. And so I went to the employment office in the courthouse to get on the list for another job. And I told the guy, I've forgotten the names, but I knew their names then because it was a small town. And I told him about this guy where I had just worked. And I told him that he let me go, but I was afraid he'd have something to do with my getting hired again. And he said, No, that won't hurt you at all because we already have his number. And I think I have a good job for you right now. And he said, go down to the ASC office. It was agriculture and I've forgotten what it stands for now, but go down there and talk to Sid Collins, and he can use you right now. So I just went downstairs. They're in the courthouse, and got right on at a pretty good job there, and I worked there till we moved to Waco. But that run-in with that guy, well, I didn't have a run-in. He just laid me off. But I didn't like the way he was doing it. But that didn't affect me at all as far as working from then on. I always had pretty good jobs.
So what did, when my mother was growing up and when you had the kids, what was your typical day like when they would go to school and come home? What did y'all do? Did you have a TV? Did you have a radio?
Well, after I married and we had a TV, we didn't have a TV when I was growing up. You ask about when I had, after I had my children, but let me back up just a few years. While we were home, my brother Clyde we didn't have a radio. Back then, a radio, they called them loudspeakers. And my brother Woodrow would go over to visit his friend, about his same age, across the country. He'd go over and visit him because he had a loudspeaker is what they'd call it. He didn't say radio, he just said they have a loudspeaker over there. Well, it's a loudspeaker radio is what it was. But Clyde would build crystal sets. You'd take a board and build and have copper coils that you'd wind a coil, and they had some way of hooking it up and have little crystals and needles that they could tune in. They'd make a radio just by putting stuff together. Clyde would build on a heavy board. He'd build a radio and fix it to where he could set that needle just right on that crystal, and he had earphones. He had wires and earphones, and he'd sit there and just laugh, listening to the Saturday night fun programs like the Grand Ole Opera and the comedians, and he'd get it to come in really loud sometimes. It'd be loud, and he'd sit over there in a corner where he had done his radio and just sit there and laugh and listen to that on the Saturday night. And we didn't have we didn't have a radio at that time. And we had finally, before I left home, we finally got a TV. But my mother, all during the war, see, Carol was overseas. Carol was over in Europe, France, Germany, England, during World War II. And my mother would sit glued to that TV, to that radio, and listen to Gabriel Heater. Gabriel Heater would give the news every day about the war and everything. And Mama, all the boys were in the service, except one that was married. And so she was so interested in her boys that she wouldn't miss any of the Gabriel Heater news to see how the war was going, and especially Carol. But I think it was an interesting. Carol was in the medics too, so I think it was more interesting for him than those that was firing their guns all the time.
So then you had, when you were, when you had your kids, you had TV then.
Had what?
You had a TV then at home when you
I had the TV. I had a TV during the time my kids were growing up.
What was on back then? Anything good? How many channels did you have?
Oh, probably 8 or 10. Maybe not that many. We'd probably not even have. We might not have even had more than 3 or 5. Because you'd have to have an arrow, you'd have to have an antenna or something to bring in very much. We had an antenna one time while the kids were at home, I think. But I don't know, I think I had I think we had pretty good luck with having our 3 kids. I think they were probably unusually good, considering what goes on today. But I can't think of any real bad goings on. They enjoyed each other pretty well. Sometimes I would leave Larry in charge of Vicky, your mama, and then she would tell me, she'd get scared. She said, Larry went somewhere with Joe, and he left me there by myself, and I was scared. And he was supposed to be, I was at work, and he was supposed to be keeping Vicky, and he'd step out somewhere with Joe and his friend, and she would tell on him. And I remember one time when your mama was fairly young, Marsh was there with her, and she's supposed to clean up the kitchen, I think. And she whined and she whined, and Morris finally told her he'd clean up the dishes, and it relieved her greatly. And then they laughed about fixing onion sandwiches. She and Morris.
Ooh.
When she was there with him one day. They had everybody had pretty much fun though. I just hope that all the other families can have as much fun as we had. I wish y'all could all have as much fun together and be reasonable and good, reasonably good. You hear what I'm saying? Reasonably good. And remember this, the reason that kids need parents is to guide, tell them how to train and to guide. Because kids, you may not believe it, but kids don't know how to grow up by themselves. They have to be guided. That's what parents are for, is to guide and raise their children by guiding and telling them how until they're of age, and your early learning is what you go by the rest of your life. And that's why it's so important to heed your first training, because that's your life, is what you're getting before you get out in the world. And you take advantage of what your daddy tells you to do or not to do. Both of you take advantage of what he tells you to do or not to do, and that will help you in later life to know how to make decisions, what's best to do and best not to do, and how to train your own children when you're grown, when you have boys and girls that you have to train. You have to kind of show them and get them started in real life. It's good to have fun when you're home. Have fun, but also stay in the bounds of what your mother and daddy tell you to do. And this is teaching you for later on, because you're not going to always have your parents to tell you how to do. And they're teaching you now. So you have to pay attention to what they're teaching you now and do what they say, and you'll be fine later on. You understand? They're telling you how to be good later on, when you're having to make your own living, and if you get married, make somebody else's living. So you have to be prepared for that. You don't grow up doing what you think is right as long as it's safe. That's not good for a kid to do that. Doing what they want to do as long as it's safe, that's no good. That's not a good policy. Do what your parents tell you to do. And when you have to make your own decision, be sure it's safe. That's